All right, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Once again, thank you all so much for joining our webinar today. My name is Christian Korea. I'm one of the partners at Cashflow Champs, and I handle a lot of our marketing and branding efforts and also help on the acquisition side. I'm very excited about the topic that we're going to be talking about today because I think it's one of those that oftentimes gets overlooked, especially in the commercial real estate space and in the multifamily space, of course, right? And it's this idea of doing proper due diligence on your assets, right? We talk a lot about how to properly underwrite and vet deals, right, for their viability. We also talk a lot about raising capital, right? And that's this super sexy thing that everybody's out there trying to do. But oftentimes we kind of skip over the basics, and the basics are basically what put the picture together, right? And so that's why I'm super excited about this topic here, because I think due diligence is super critical to your success in the commercial real estate space. But with that, quick disclaimer before we start, right? I'm not an attorney, I'm not a financial advisor, I'm not a tax advisor, accountant, and so on and so forth. So today's presentation is going to be for educational purposes only. So, whenever you're making decisions, make sure you're seeking the proper guidance and advice from actual professionals, right? So super excited for this today. And a little bit more about myself before we dive in. I am an immigrant, right? My family is from Guatemala, and I always bring this up whenever I'm networking with people because it kind of just shows you that when you enter the real estate space, people have different backgrounds, right? You're going to meet and interact and network and partner with people from different countries that speak different languages, right? That have different skill sets. And so that's something that's always attracted me to real estate, and something I always sort of mention as well. I'm former Barclays, so I used to work in banking back in the day within their financial institutions group. I currently work with Deloitte Consulting in their healthcare space. I own a couple of restaurants in the Washington, D.C. area. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm a partner with Cashflow Champ, so I handle a lot of our marketing and branding efforts, and then also help on the acquisition side as well, right? And part of the work on the acquisition side does deal with due diligence. So this is actually something it actually makes me super excited to talk about due diligence, because you kind of get to see everything up in close in action, right? And when we talk about underwriting, it's really what helps you put your complete picture together, right? And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But before that, just a couple of useful links here, and these are QR codes that are scannable. So if you have your phone handy, you want to schedule a call with us, you can do so with the QR code on the top left hand, or you could use this link here. For those of you that may be newer to the real estate space and that may be new joining us today, we do lead a weekly underwriting session completely free. And the whole purpose of this session is to help you or help us democratize real estate investing, right? Over the years, we've spoken to thousands of professionals, and something we continue to hear from folks is that, they're very interested, but they're scared, right? Or they don't know how to analyze a deal. And so during these Saturday sessions, we literally take a multi-million-dollar deal from scratch, looking at its financials. We analyze it within a 2 to 3 hour time frame, and we check its viability, right? And so we play with the numbers until certain return metrics are met, and we know what price we're able to pay for that. So it's a super great interactive session, right? Where we're engaging with all of the folks that are in attendance. It's virtual, it's free, and you don't have much to lose, right? So if you are newer to real estate and you are interested in learning more about how to properly analyze and vet deals, highly encourage you to join us there. And then the last QR code here is for our coaching program. So for those of you that don't know, democratizing real estate is super important to us, right? And so we, the partners at Cashflow Champs, have realized that real estate truly has the ability to transform lives, right? Both for us as investors, but also for the individuals, right? The residents that live in the communities that we operate, right? So we always try to help people that are looking to get involved in real estate. So if you are newer to the real estate space and you are looking to get involved in the multifamily space, please scan the QR code. We'd be happy to chat with you a little bit more about our coaching program and how we're working actively with many of our students to help them break into the multifamily real estate space. I'll also drop my phone number in the chat box here. So if you happen to have any questions, feel free to give me a ring or text me. We're super transparent about this stuff. All right, let's get to the meat and potatoes here. So in this webinar, we're going to cover a couple of things, right? So it'll be about 20 minutes long. We'll leave a couple of minutes open for any Q&A that may arise. And these are the main topics that we're going to talk about today, right? And I'll preface the presentation here with a quick anecdote, right? A lot of the things that we learn are theoretical in nature, right? At face value, they may make sense. But what I oftentimes tell folks is when you actually get out there, right, the practical knowledge you learn, the hands-on experience, that's what really helps you learn, right? So, absolutely continue to consume content, right? Continue to educate yourself, but realize that it's super important to take action as well, right? So if you are newer to the space, right, maybe you have mentors that you can connect with, right? Maybe you reach out to us, right? And you say, hey guys, if you ever acquire an asset in my market, right, could you please let me know? I'd love to tag along to see how things actually work when you're on the field, right? So again, right, always practicality, super important, take action and reach out whenever you need help. But with that, a couple of topics we'll cover here. So what is due diligence? We'll talk a little bit about the basics, how to think about it. How to proceed with the results from your due diligence. So this is basically looking at, all right, so now we've done our due diligence. We found out A, B, and C. What's next, right? Another topic we'll cover is negotiations with the seller and avoiding pitfalls. So, it's not new news that sometimes you'll do due diligence and you'll find a lot of things that you weren't expecting, right? Maybe environmental concerns. So how do we navigate that? And then, of course, much more. But with that, what is due diligence? So I'll leave this up on the screen for you all to sort of read at your leisure as you're listening here, but I'll kind of break it down at a pretty high level, right? So during the disposition and or acquisition process, right, depending if you're a buyer or seller, proper due diligence, which is primarily the responsibility of the buyer, ensures that the buyer spends an adequate amount of time exploring and inspecting the property, its financial considerations, and compliance obligations with the intention of limiting and mitigating financial, regulatory, environmental, or legal concerns and ambiguities. Right. So what I basically mean by this is, when I'm going out and I'm buying a property or an asset, I want to make sure I know what I'm buying. Right. So I'm going to check title. Right. I'm going to check encumbrances. I'm going to make sure I check the financial stability of the property. Right. So you want to do a lease audit. And we'll talk a little bit more about all of these things. But in due diligence, you're basically going out there and you're seeing and asking yourself, am I getting what I'm paying for? If not, what do I need to budget for? Right? Do I need to renegotiate with the seller on certain items? Right? So what are the three main types of due diligence? So the three main types of due diligence you'll oftentimes hear people talk about are physical, financial, and legal. I threw an extra star in here. So I'm actually going to make it 4 because I'm going to say there's actually 4, but people talk about 3. So the fourth one is environmental. And so we'll sort of work our way down here, but physical due diligence involves completing a full property inspection with a qualified building engineer or a property manager, right? So whenever you're going out and you're doing due diligence on assets, oftentimes there are firms that you can hire to help you go out there and actually do the due diligence on an asset. So oftentimes this will be called a property condition assessment or a capital needs assessment. So if you ever see acronyms PSA or CNA, it's referring to that physical due diligence of an asset. So in this stage, buyers should be concerned about the structural integrity of the asset they're buying, right? So I always tell folks, right, think about the foundation to your home. If the foundation to your home is cracked, the house is coming down, right? So you want to make sure you're reviewing this during your due diligence, right? Because it's super important. But also sellers should be concerned about any deferred maintenance, right? And how it impacts that pricing of the asset, right? So if you're a seller and you're not doing basic due diligence on an asset, when you go out and you are involved in the disposition phase of this asset or you're looking to sell it, that deferred maintenance may come back and haunt you, right? Because people are going to do their proper due diligence, fingers crossed, and they're going to find out if deferred maintenance is present, right? But structural features under review could include things like HVAC equipment, right? Electrical systems, plumbing, roof systems, structural walls is a super big one. Maybe window seal waterproofing, elevator systems, if the asset has that, right? ADA compliance, right? Fire safety compliance. So these are the kind of things that you're looking through whenever you're looking at like the physical aspects of a property. And if any questions come up, feel free to drop them in the chat or in the Q&A and we'll answer them as we go too. So the next part here is financial, right? So some people will call this financial and operational due diligence. It's kind of one and the same, but during financial due diligence, all parties are going to review the property financial statements, right? It is imperative that buyers understand the expenses and cash receipts that may be coming along with the real estate they're purchasing. So sellers should have a strong understanding of operating expenses and, of course, the NOI, if applicable, and how they affect the buyer's underwriting, right? Because at the end of the day, I think sometimes as investors, we may fall in love with how an asset looks. But at the end of the day, right, remember when you're going out and you're buying commercial real estate, when you're buying an asset, you're buying a business, right? And that's the way you got to think about it. I'm buying a business, right? And so it's a numbers game. You got to make sure you're meeting your return metrics. You got to think about operational efficiencies, right? How are you going to improve this asset, right? So it's all a numbers game. So as you're doing your financial due diligence, you want to make sure you're verifying the current performance of the asset, right? So, review the historical cash flow statements, right? Assess vendor contracts and liabilities, right? Maybe there's a master contract on this property for cable, right? Those are things that you always want to be aware about because they may be things you want to control, right? They may be contracts you want to renegotiate. But you also want to look at the rent roll and other lease terms. And you want to audit historical expenses, right? So that includes things like property tax bills, maybe from the previous year, 2 or 3. So super important there, right? And the big thing with financials, just remember, it's a numbers game. You're buying a business. Don't fall in love with the asset. You're buying a business. The third aspect here is legal, right? So it's sometimes called legal and title due diligence. And this is primarily conducted to confirm that the seller has sufficient authority to enter into the commercial real estate transaction. So this one, I cannot stress how important this is. And I'll kind of give you all a personal example here from one of my relatives. So one of my family members recently bought up a bunch of acreage in Central America, a bunch of land that she plans on subdividing and selling off, right? Or that was the initial plan. And she bought the land from a couple of attorneys. And one thing she's going through now is somebody else is claiming that they owned that land, right? And so something they're going through now with a bunch of like illegal filings and whatnot is who truly owned the land, right? And this is where you start to get into that discussion of warranty deed versus quit claim deed, right? So when you're going through this process, it is imperative, right? Super imperative. Imagine buying land from somebody that doesn't own it, right? You need to make sure and confirm that the seller is who they say they are and that they do have the authority to sell that asset, right? And to address any liens or charges, unpaid taxes, or any easements, right? Easements are pretty common, right? So you want to make sure you're looking into all of this, because if the seller cannot, the buyer should be comfortable with what remains on the title or the property after closing, right? So the buyer is concerned here that there are title encumbrances or physical encroachments that prevent the seller from conveying marketable title, right? So from, enabling or letting you actually take over this property. So title due diligence may also be required by financial lenders. It actually, I'd say 99% of the time it is, if not 100, it is required by financial lenders prior to approving title or the actual transactions. If there are title issues, the seller will be held accountable, right, to eliminate any encumbrances, typically negotiating with third parties. But oftentimes, if there are title issues or legal issues, it could put the transaction at risk, right? But the type of due diligence may include, of course, a review of the title, review of the ALTA survey, and you want to confirm zoning compliance, right? So you want to make sure you're within the barriers and perimeter of the property and what it actually owns. The last one here is environmental. So quick thing before I dive into environmental. Again, right, you always hear people talk about physical, financial, legal. I think those are the three main ones, but environmental is also an important one. So I would throw that into the bucket as the fourth main one. But environmental due diligence is also a very important one. So when conducting an environmental due diligence, buyers typically commission a new phase one or ESA, right? So some of you may have heard of a phase one assessment or ESA. An ESA is an environmental site assessment, same thing. Or update an existing ESA, right? Oftentimes the lender will require the ESAs, but what you're doing when you do this and you go out and search for this is you're checking for any hazardous material that may have impacted the soil, the groundwork, or building components, right? This type of due diligence also involves revisiting and assessing any environmental draft reports provided by the seller. So in situations where the phase one report identifies an issue, a phase two will be required. So phase two report. And basically it just digs deeper into the issue to determine the actual severity of the issue and the associated remediation costs, right? So whenever you have any issues that are hazardous, you're going to have remediation costs involved, right? So always be thinking about that. But a phase one will look for any traces of items such as petroleum products, maybe dangerous chemicals, radon's a big one, hazardous building elements. So, if a property is located next to a dry cleaners, right, you could have some type of issue, right? If the property is located next to a gas station, right, you could have some type of issue, right? So always be sort of thinking about that, because I think this could be a really big issue, right? Like, let's say you skip an ESA and you find out your water is contaminated, right? Like, there will be legal ramifications. I guarantee that. But in the process, we're also harming the residents that live in our communities, right? And that's unacceptable, right? I always tell people, You need to be a purpose-driven entrepreneur, right? You need to bridge purpose and profit. You need to bridge that, right? It is possible to do well for yourself while being moral, while having values, while being ethical, right? So whenever you're engaging in transactions, always think long term, right? Is this something that I could be proud of? Right? Is this something where I'm harming someone? If so, how do I avoid that? How do I remediate that? So environmental super, super important. And last couple of points on this before I kind of open it up to everybody. But if the seller has been operating from a property and suspects that there aren't any environmental issues, let's say maybe asbestos containing materials, it is warranted to conduct an ESA prior to taking the property to market, right? So the seller should know the environmental condition of the property and associated costs to remediate that, right? So, if you're a seller and you're going out there and you're saying, well, man, I had no idea that was an issue. Well, that you're not going to get off that easy, right? So this information will impact the pool of potential buyers, right? The pricing and of course the timing of closing, depending on how long that may take. But regardless of the transaction size, the parties must pay attention to all of the critical components that comprise a proper due diligence process, right? So when working with an experienced advisor, you need to feel comfortable that the work that they're doing is looking at the grand scheme of things, right? That it is looking at the big picture, right? That it's taking into account, yes, the three main types of due diligence, right? Physical, financial, and legal, but that you're also looking at the environmental concerns as well, right? So this kind of just shows you, right? There are so many moving pieces to a real estate transaction. And oftentimes it can be a little bit overwhelming, right? How can one person do this? And the answer is you don't do it as one person, right? You have a team, right? This is why you go out and you partner with maybe experienced operators, or you go out there and you find firms that can help you do this, right? So a lot of moving pieces, but there are firms out there that you can hire to help you through the process. So next phase here, what happens after due diligence? And I was thinking about this slide a little bit and asking myself, well, what should we include on this slide? And I realized, typically it's one of three things, right, that happens after due diligence. The first one, everything checks a box, we move on. That's phenomenal, right? We just had a due diligence inspection recently where everything, I was pretty surprised myself, where everything kind of checked the box, and we had enough allotted in our CapEx budget to sort of move forward with the transaction. But if that happens, golden, right? Let's close this transaction. Let's make sure the lender gets everything they need. Let's raise this capital, right? Second point, hold on, we need to renegotiate. So let me give you an example. Let's say you're doing due diligence and you find out that this property has a bunch of structural issues, right? Structural issues that were not disclosed to you, structural issues that you hadn't budgeted for or had not budgeted for in your CapEx budget, right? In those instances, you go back to the seller, or you can go back to the seller, right, if you want. And this is oftentimes called retrading. So in a couple of years ago, I'd say even early last year, the real estate market's been super hot the last couple of years. And, people will always say, don't retrade, right? The worst thing you can do out there is go out and retrade, because then you're going to get the reputation of a retrader, right? And I don't think that's a good way to position the messaging. I actually think it's a horrible way to position the messaging. And the way you need to think about this is go back to what I said earlier, right? You are buying a business, right? If I go out and I buy a restaurant, but I get there and I have no PP&E, right? Let's say they took everything from the kitchen. Did I get what I paid for? The answer is probably no, right? So you need to be very strategic whenever you're doing these negotiations, right? So you as a buyer, you need to figure out, what can I live with? What can I not live with, right? So if it is a big issue and it is going to impact pricing, I think it's worthwhile having that discussion, right? So that's the second one there. The last point is we didn't see this coming. We need to drop the deal, right? And that is usually one of those super big issues. A couple of years ago, we were doing due diligence on an asset, and we had been informed that the current seller had invested a couple $1 million into the asset. And long story short, after due diligence, we didn't really see where that money had been spent because it wasn't necessarily showing itself or displaying itself in the actual improvement of the asset, right, and its performance. And so, long story short, we ended up dropping that deal, right? But you will have circumstances where that does happen, right? And in those instances, maybe you have spent some money drafting the legal documents, right? Maybe you have spent some money doing due diligence, right? But something that one of my mentors told me very early on was some of the best deals are the deals you don't do, right? So don't force yourself into deals, right? Simply because you've gotten involved. Yes, it's very unfortunate to drop a transaction, but you are buying a business. If you are syndicating, you are probably using people's money, right? If I bring my mother and she invests $50,000 into a deal that we're doing, man, I better dot my I's and I better cross my T's, because these people work way too hard for their money for you to go out there and force deals, right? So again, right, going back to this idea of being a purpose-driven entrepreneur, right? Bridge purpose and profits, right? Act morally, have values, have ethics, and stick to them, right? Because it is possible to do well in this space while taking all of that into account. But that is pretty much it for our presentation today. So before I open it up, I think Paul and Prashant have probably brought this up in the past, but we are currently still raising for our Park Valley apartment homes opportunity. Again, this is only open to accredited investors, and we'll be closing in about a week or so, and we still have a couple of slots still open. So if you are an accredited investor and you are interested in this opportunity, definitely check it out, and definitely reach out, right? You all have my number and you have our contact information. So register for next week's webinar. It's going to be a good one. Kind of what we talked about earlier, a big goal of ours is to always democratize real estate investing, right? I think real estate investing, it can be complicated, right? But if you have the systems, the processes, if you have the relationships, right, it can make it a lot more simple, right? You can lessen your learning curve. So we definitely look forward to seeing you all next week. And we thank you for joining today. Absolutely, absolutely. And I'll leave this up for a minute or two. Please feel free to scan that and register for next week. Feel free to send the link off to a friend or a relative that may be interested in joining us. And we look forward to seeing you all next week.